Hello and welcome to Billigence's short video on campus utilization. Here we're going to show you how we've helped one of our clients to solve some complex rooming issues and help them to optimize their space while inform their investment strategy. So just first to introduce Billigence in case you haven't heard of us. In essence, we are a global reach consultancy. We change and improve the way people work with data, very much focusing on shortening the time to value ratio and increasing efficiency whilst utilizing resources to maximum potential. Basically, it's about blending the right technology, tools, and the right level of consultancy to deliver the best outcomes for our clients. So you may have seen other videos like our student number planning demonstration video. So what we want to do today is just highlight some of the use cases that we work on in higher education. We very much provide simple, customized tool sets and modeling services that help to make a big impact on decision making, planning and collaboration within an institution, very much driven by business value and return on investment. For instance, starting at one end of the scale in student recruitment, we help to profile students and understand who are going to be your best performers, which is especially valuable when it comes to clearing, because you want to be able to identify the right students to accept and offer those acceptances as quick as possible throughout the clearing process. Once done that, you also want to understand which of those students is going to be turning into an at-risk student throughout their life cycle at the university. So we help to monitor the health of that student and help them understand which are the most successful pathways and which are suboptimal pathways so that you can avoid them making bad choices. So at the other end, at student number planning and campus utilization, what we want to show here is that we are able to join together the dots that have been created when it comes to the entire process at a higher education institution. So we're conscious that a number of silos have been built up, for example, how financial planning and analysis happens, how timetabling happens, and then how room allocation happens. So what we want to show is that we can all work from single sources of truth and help the right hand to understand what the left hand is doing and help to understand the impact of making changes in the student number planning process or in the room allocation process. So just to highlight just how interconnected the student number planning process is with the campus utilization, we also need to think a bit wider and understand its impact on the teaching and research workload modeling. Obviously, we mentioned financial planning, but the timetabling element and the predicting and preventing dropout. We want to answer questions like, how does adding or removing a course affect the demand on campus resources? Now, that's not a one-word answer that you'll get from that. You have to look at the various strands that question can affect. Can we cope with winning new research bids? Because, of course, a research bid not only has a people implication, but also has a rooming requirement around where that research will take place. How do we best distribute workload between teaching and research? And how do we distribute that workload around rooms as well? We want to enable departments to understand the impact of change and plan for it in advance. So today we're going to detail a use case with one of our higher education clients, a top-tier UK-based university with a global outreach. The initial brief was actually to help them understand whether they really needed to invest millions of pounds in a single 350 plus capacity lecture theatre. In essence, we were given this brief by the Director of Estates, who was working from hearsay. In essence, they were receiving demands from academics saying that they needed this extra investment in new premises, but really there was no data to back it up. So we started the engagement, but what we found, literally as soon as we scratched the surface, was that they were also unable to match room sizes and class sizes together. There were centrally and departmentally bookable spaces that were being booked but not utilised. There was definitely a need for evidence-based strategy for campus development, and that actually they were spending millions of pounds on external teaching spaces in terms of conference facilities when they were overbooked. So in essence, we wanted to help them with cost avoidance as well. So to set the scene on the solution overview, we've really got to start with what the actual challenges were. It's very well to say we can use Alteryx for quite a lot of things, but to back this up as to why, the data itself came from different sources. We had a list of events, which was timetabling data. We also had a list of rooms, which in essence is stock data. And the first set of tasks were actually to clean that data, break the events down into half-hourly events and throughout the calendar year. We also had to look at the rooms themselves and understand, well, firstly, are we counting rooms that don't exist anymore? Are we counting rooms that are under refurbishment at the moment? We also need to break it down in terms of size of room, whether it's classroom style, theatre style, lab style, and also whether they had any equipment that was required, access, what floor they were on, the distance from certain points, etc. Added to that, we also needed to bring in some new sensor data, which was, in essence, it's time series data that is going to come in from another third party. They're recording basically the occupancy level of those rooms, and therefore that is also coming from a separate database. So the job here really was to not only clean that data, but bring it together and format it and prepare it in a way that makes sense to do analysis from. Now, the challenge here, of course, is that we didn't have direct access to those databases. We were getting extracts. So it was a case that we had to do something on a repetitive basis, because once we made a change and helped them put a new class into a different room, we had to rerun that workflow and understand what impact it had. So that's why Alteryx was the perfect solution. Beyond that, after transforming all the data, we also needed to visually see the outcomes, because you cannot really ascertain where you are with just rows and rows of spreadsheet. Quickest way of doing this analysis was actually to do it in a visualization tool. So we chose Tableau because it was already at the university, and we were able to quickly produce some dashboards that help people target areas for improvement rapidly. So we'd like to highlight here just how easy this was to do in Alteryx. This is a simplified version of the workflow. There's a couple of macros in here, but what we're looking to show here is that there's three main elements, which is calculating the supply. So breaking this down into available hours for each room. There's a calculation engine that we've built in Alteryx to do this. Next is event data, so parsing it to create rows for each week, day and hour of when the event took place. And lastly, bringing the sensors data against the frequency and occupation and utilization analysis, so that we can actually enrich the data with some real insights as to whether a room was being booked and not utilized, whether it was being booked for 100 people but only actually occupied by 20%, say, for example. So we're looking at bookings that were really causing a knock-on effect. Basically the thing I want to highlight here is that we changed what was a horrible and repetitive manual process that in essence you couldn't complete all the tasks in a timely manner. We changed that into a literally one-click sub 60-second workflow. The benefit, of course, of which is enabling the team to do much more with their time now. Rather than being stuck in a manual analysis task, we've freed them up to be able to actually do some analysis and make some changes that can really make improvements to the university. So some of the simple yet eye-opening results of this exercise were that we were able to understand the academic year utilization overall. But not only that, is helping them understand the data as it changes over time, the identification of the most and least utilized rooms, and helping to dig a little deeper to understand why they are being avoided or why they're being favored by individuals. Helping to understand when those peak weeks are, the peak days, the peak hours, so that we can look at the effect that has on timetabling, and rather whether we can make better use of the resources by changing the timetable slightly. We also looked at the external premises usage analysis, because of course there is an extra cost to that. It's not a sunken cost in terms of the real estate you already have, but you're paying a third party to utilize their facilities. So we looked at these facilities in different categories, the capacities they have, what they were being used for, the types of lessons, and also whether there were any particular individuals or schools that were favouring using external space for any particular reason. Now that enabled the university to speak with them and understand whether there's a specific reason or whether some sort of cultural change is required to help them reduce the external spend on those external spaces when we have very good spaces that obviously the university can leverage. And lastly, it's helping them understand how it evolves in terms of the plan versus reality. Doing a comparison between the timetable system and the actual sensors, helping to understand, which rooms are being blocked out and not used, and whether this is repeat offences. These signify clearly that people don't want to share their toys. So it really is helping to understand the reasoning behind, why things happen, so that they can identify what's the best solution they can put to each of those individual problems. Alteryx is a great tool for use cases where you need to leverage multiple data sources, blend them together, clean them, apply some business logic, which in this case was quite difficult, as you have multiple data sources from multiple third parties that own the data set. And at the end, you typically want to produce some final outputs that you want to share with the final audience. So in this instance, Alteryx was a perfect fit for the campus utilization use case. Today, I'm going to show the campus utilization piece of work which we've done for a top-tier university in the UK. Obviously, I'll just be showing you the concept of it using demo data for confidentiality purposes, but this will still allow you to easily understand the workflow as a whole, as well as its individual components, giving you insights into how this analysis works. To explain the basic concept of Alteryx, it's utilizing a drag and drop approach, using a selection of individual tools, connecting them together to create a workflow, and then rerunning the logic repeatedly to automate the previous manual process. So in a nutshell, Alteryx strikes the perfect balance between data transformation and process automation, allowing business users to create bespoke data modeling without the need for technical developers or engineers. Let me first describe the individual components of the model, as this will be more of a follow-up of the key analytical tasks described in the previous slides. Firstly, we need to understand what's the frequency, occupancy, and utilization of the individual rooms and teaching spaces, along with what the utilization per faculty is, so that you can break it down into individual schools or departments to see where the greatest opportunities for improvement exist. Next, you'll also want to compare the planned versus actual. There are three main components of the model. The first one being supply, which means the supply of teaching space. It can consist of multiple different data sources, and the first here is a list of buildings, where they are and what teaching space I have in my campus or anywhere else. Going a bit deeper, you can see the detail of individual rooms, my teaching space inside these buildings. Each of the rooms may have different capacities, each of them will be on different floors, some of them will be internal, some of them will be external. However, you still want to keep all of this data accessible for analysis, so that you know where your classes are taking place. So when blending these together, another important input in the supply part is the opening hours. Obviously, you won't be running classes overnight, so most likely there'll be some limitations in terms of times. They may even differ day to day. Typically, they may be somewhere between 8 AM or until 7 PM or 5 PM, etc. And I have a separate input for external conference spaces, hotels or overspill facilities that you may have, where these will have their own limitations in terms of rental. So you'll need to be able to take these into account and change these opening times to do various what-if scenarios. So you could look at different options, such as, what if we extend the opening hours, closing the school at 8 PM instead of 7 PM, and then understand what impact it'll have on the classes. The final part we have here as an input is a split of weeks in between terms. So you may want to be able to break down the utilization per different term, as throughout the academic year there may be multiple different events taking place, like the exam periods towards the end of the academic year, etc. So what I do here in the supply processing, if I look at the results window here, what I want to have is each block for each room as one supply hour. So you can see that my room 0 in term 1, week 1, Monday, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, and so on. I have all the blocks of rooms available, which I've generated, listing a full supply of the rooms throughout the whole academic year. The second component of the model is the demand. Those are the room bookings and thus the actual teaching events that took place. Here you can determine the individual requests for spaces that are made throughout the different periods within the academic year. So you can see here event 1001 in Department 2. And this particular event takes place in weeks 15 to 35. It occurs every Thursday, it takes 3 hours, starts at 2 p.m, finishes at 5, and the expected participants, which is what was requested for, not the actual, it's just the demand, according to the lecturer, in this case it's 28. And then we have some additional information about from where each department IDs are coming from, so if it's faculty A, B, C, etc. Then after some processing, what I need to get here are records generated for each individual event. So under weeks, you can see here event 1003. So let me go back to that. We can see, yes, takes place between weeks 21 to 40. So in this case, for that event, I have weeks 21 to 40. So again, I have generated rows for all individual blocks when that event is going to take place. So moving on into the third component of the model, obviously first I need to join these two together based on room IDs, weeks, days, hours, and I'll join these together so I'll know, okay, in this particular event that was demanded, it took place in those blocks, so I have fast insight into what utilization rate of those rooms is. So far we've only looked at what the demand is and what are the requests for teaching spaces, and obviously very important is to do some checks and comparisons between planned versus actual, for which I have to bring in the actual utilization. Universities typically use multiple different tools for either capturing attendance or seeing who's in the room, and in this case we had sensors installed in the rooms and they were updating every 15 minutes, so providing us with information about how many people entered the room and how many left the room. So at any point we knew how many people were inside this room. So if we then again join it together, we can see, okay, in that event, if it was requested for 28 people, we can actually see whether there were actually 28, if it was less or more, which already gives us a really good indication of what's going on in that room. So after some blending, I get to the point where I have all of this joined together and I can now move on to some visualization. This can either be done using reporting tools in Alteryx, so you have options like creating charts or tables, and you can generate reports with headers and render them into multiple formats, so PDFs, PowerPoints and many more. You can also trigger an email to have it generated automatically and sent to a specific audience or recipient. Or in this case, I have a sample visualization in Tableau, which our client was already using for other analytical activities across the institution. Before switching to Tableau to show you some sample outputs of some analysis, you may remember from the beginning that we were interested in 3 different measures: frequency, occupancy, and utilization. And it's very important that you understand how they're calculated first. So this picture explains how these individual measures are calculated. Frequency really looks at slots. So in this example, if I have one room with capacity of 10 seats, and throughout one day I have 8 available slots from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. So 8 hours means 8 slots. So frequency really purely looks at slots, meaning if the room was utilized in 5 slots, it can, for example, be between 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. and then from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. or true or false is used or not used type of data input. And that has nothing to do with capacity or utilization. Now, occupancy looks at a number of people within all time slots throughout the day, but only looks at used time slots. So if it was only used in those 5 throughout the day, that gives us 5 times 10. Utilization is more of a holistic view. So we can measure utilization by taking the total number of people within all the time slots, which in this case is 24, and we divide that by the total number of all time slots, which is 8, multiplied by the room capacity, which is 10. So in essence, 24 divided by 80, which is 0.3 or 30%. In Tableau, I can switch between these measures and it shows me, well in this case, frequency by week, and I can break it down by term so that I can see, for example, that in week 15, frequency was around 50%, whilst in the rest of the time it was lower. And I can then break it down according to multiple options. So for example, here we can quickly see that Mondays and Wednesdays seem to have the highest frequencies. However, you can also see that mornings tend to be utilized less, and you can see that here by utilization per hour, it tends to go up sometime after lunch, which is also quite interesting. I can look at occupancy by switching to it, as well as utilization, which shows here it being around 8 to 25% on average. And I can also look at the actuals from the sensors, which are in fact even lower. And this gives us the desired comparison between the demand and the actual utilization based on real life data. Now this is a calendar view. So if I have data from the entire academic year, I can then see how we perform throughout all the weeks, spotting potential issues with capacity, or actually seeing when teaching space is fully available for some other types of events such as research, etc. And next up is the comparison of scheduled versus real utilization, occupancy and frequency. The coloured bars are showing scheduled events, whilst the black lines represent actual values based on sensor data. So looking at the data, it seems that every time, which may be one exception in the first value of frequency rate by hour, but the actual utilization was lower in comparison with demand, which means that less people were attending morning classes than were expected. And you can then drill down into particular rooms, for example, room 12, to see what the metrics look like for that particular teaching space. Moving on to the overview of highest and lowest utilized rooms. We can again also compare scheduled versus real utilization of each room, or moving forward we can also compare scheduled and used versus scheduled and not used, and break it down per faculty or department. Now this will start to highlight where the opportunity for improvement exists by helping to avoid future no-shows. But please bear in mind here that we're using demo data, and with demo data you don't see as many patterns as you would with the real data that's much more interesting. You really do highlight the differences among different faculties and departments or individual rates. They're often quite distinct. So these types of reports would give you great insight into the effectiveness of your booking operations. And last but not least, we'll look into the overview by capacity category, breaking the data down into three main categories. So up to 50 people, between 51 and 100, and 101 to 150. Where you can see the scheduled event details providing information about real premise use. So for example, 15 people attending that took place in a lecture room for 150 people. So clearly highlighting where you can optimize first to gain the biggest returns. So by putting all this together, it really gives you quite a good idea of what's happening in the campus utilization space within your organization. You can then obviously deep dive into multiple other metrics that you may have available. For example, you might want to compare the internal versus external teaching spaces in detail and correlate them with any other data at your disposal and get a greater picture of what's happening, enable you to improve your decision-making process across the organization. So just to summarize, having worked with many universities over the last 4 years, we've built up a really good understanding of operations. And the types of activity that reporting and analytic solutions need to deliver over time. For instance, we believe that by having evidence-based reporting of the current and historical state, we'll be able to support what-if modelling and scenario planning. We understand that in order to plan and make the most of your resources, you will need to support the analysis and rules-based decisioning and understand the impact of those. So for example, we can support decisions in timetabling by quickly modelling the scenario against the allocated rooming in the campus. We can help define which rooms to target for reshaping or upgrading to cater for different types of learning in the future. We can scenario plan based on access requirements or the travel or time between lectures for particular students. And we can also create rules in the data that alert when attendance falls below certain thresholds or in order to support your Tier 4 engagement monitoring policy. So therefore there are quite a lot of possibilities in terms of what you can do, and this is really just to highlight that a single version of the truth is really quite key when it comes to helping break down the silos and helping different departments to understand the impact of their changes to the model. So thank you very much. If you'd like to get in contact with any particular questions, please find our details here. It'd be a pleasure speaking with you.